whichever you want to say.
That's what's that called when a word has that? There's a word. There's a term for a word.
Palindrome?
No.
I know what you mean.
It's where a word, like when you put the top up, the top down, right? Like
opposite meanings, like flammable and inflammable.
Right. Yeah. Okay, here we are. So it was a very bit of a jarring reality when you turn this thing on and it shoots your face right back at you. Not exactly something that is fun to see. Okay, I have sheets. They are very easy sheets. The sheets are just psukim, because the Gemara on today's daf is going to go through all of the shinuyim that the tzaddikim made when they changed the Torah in the story with Talmud Hamelech, which we'll get to today. Quick overview of the Gemara. We're going to be continuing with this Ein Bain story. If we have a minute at the end, I'll tell you a beautiful part I heard about the Ein Bains from Pinchas Gross on the Old Daf website. Amazing part I heard. I mean, it's really Rav Hutner's part, but he sort of really crystallized it. But I'd rather, let's finish the Daf, and if I have a minute, I'll say it after. Okay, so we're in the Ein Bain still. I think we have a couple more Ein Bain Mishnayos before we hit heavy Pirushei HaMegillah, which is going to really basically be learning Tanakh for a couple of weeks, a couple of days, whatever it is, which is going to be Geshmak. We're going to really learn Megillah good, meaning the Megillah, not the Masechet Megillah. But okay, so
we'll be ready for
exactly, yeah, exactly. So we have a couple more Ein Bain. The Ein Bain we're talking about now is it's a deceptively complicated Mishnah, meaning it's one couple of lines. It seems like it's pretty simple, but I'm going to explain it simply, but I just want to point out that it's relevant. It's related to a lot of halacha. So let's read it inside. We're holding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the bottom of the Mishnah. Ein Chesamid Beis 8b. I don't know what it is in English. Ein Bein Sfarim L'Tfilin u'Mezuzos Ela Shehasfarim Nichtavin B'Chol Lashon U'Tfilin u'Mezuzos Eino Nichtavos Ela Ashuris. So simple pshat. What we're saying here is we're going to make a distinction between Tfilin and Mezuzos versus Sfarim. And what's the difference is that Sfarim can be written in any language, and Tefillin and Mezuzos can only be written in Ashuris. Now, that sounds pretty simple. Rav Shimon Gamliel argues, and he says, Rav Shimon Gamliel,
you're saying that the script...
so you're already jumping in. Before we get there. Hold. Just hold for a second. So you're already, everyone here has an opinion. Okay. Everyone put their Rashi hats on and figure it out. I'm going to tell you that it's a little complicated. Hold on 1 second. Rav Shimon Gamliel comes along and says, no. Not all languages, Lashon HaKodesh and Ancient Greek. Those are the only 2 languages. You can see already here where we're going to get to the whole Talmud Hamelech thing. Okay, so now the question is, what is our Mishnah talking about? Is our Mishnah talking about Sefer Torah versus Tefillin and Mezuzos, and this belongs in the halachas of writing the Sefer Torah? Is this Mishnah talking about the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah versus the mitzvah of writing Tefillin and Mezuzos? Is the Mishnah not even talking about anything to do with that? It's talking about the halachas of whether you're even allowed to write and translate the Torah into any other language, right? Or are we talking about all of these potential pshatim are somehow in this Mishnah and somehow not in the Mishnah? Okay, there's another pshat, which is really the pshat that the Tosfos not here in another place talks about, which is how we're going to go through the Gemara. Is we're going to be talking about over here that we don't mean Sefer Torah itself, we mean Sfarim, and Rashi actually sort of says this. Sfarim means Tanakh, right? So now the question then becomes, and the reason why this is complicated, meaning maybe it's a simple thing, why am I overcomplicating matters, is because the Turei and the Shagas Aryeh asked this question, but really I think anyone who reads the Mishnah would have this question. Whenever you see the word Ashuris in a Mishnah, you should assume it means, in almost any other context, it's going to mean what, when you open up your tefillin and you look at the writing, or when you go open up a Sefer Torah and you look at the writing, that font, the font that we see inside a Torah, that's called Ksav Ashuris, meaning as different to then our alphabet of ABCs, or the alphabet of Ksav Ivri, which would look like Chinese does. These are different alphabets or writing systems. Writing systems is how the physical letter is put on some type of paper. Then there's a language. A language is the words I'm saying. So like, for instance, when I was in high school and elementary school and I wanted to quote unquote cheat on my Lashon test, I would write the Hebrew words in English, or I would write the English words in Hebrew, and the person didn't know the other language, they could never figure it out. So if I wanted to write down, whatever it was, the same way Moshe writes companies, Kuf, Ayin, Mem, Pei, Aleph, Nun, whatever, and it's English, but so what language is the word companies? It's not Hebrew just because he writes it in Hebrew language, letters, it's English, but he's using Hebrew letters. So if you see the word Ashuris in a Mishnah, you should generally assume this is going to be a Hilchas Stam, a Sofer Stam question. That's the complication here, because the problem is that it says Svarim, it doesn't say Sefer Torah. If it would have said Sefer Torah, the Mishnah would be really simple. Sefer Torah and Tefillin and Mezuzah are distinct in that Sefer Torah can be written in any language, and Tefillin and Mezuzah would be a halacha that you can only write it in Ksav Ashuris. The problem is, the Torah Evan says, is that's clearly not true. That's clearly not true that you can write a Sefer Torah for the halacha Sefer Torah in something that's not Lashon HaKodesh. What are we going to get up there and start reading it in Greek and reading it in English?
But are you talking like transliteration?
Transliteration is something else.
Are you
Transliteration.
doing that when the
What I
Mishnah
just
says-
said before was
No, what the Mishnah says here, that Svarim can be written in any language, but the words of the Torah.
Oh, so that there's a 5-way machlekes in the Gemara as to what it means. It's simple. Don't get nervous. There's 5 answers to a question. We're going to try to
Really?
understand it. Yeah.
But the other side is also difficult. In other words, to say we're talking about Svarim, why make halachas about Svarim? Svarim are our own choice how to write.
Right. And not only that,
Who
when
says
you
they're
say
any
the word
halachos?
Svarim, what are you referring to? Do you mean
Yeah.
the Medrash says? Does the Medrash have the same halacha as Svarim? Oh, so we're saying Sifrei Tanakh. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So the question. So this is where we have to pick a side here. Otherwise, we could spend the whole week on it. Right. So this is what I'm going to say. From the Gemara, it's clear to me that the simplest way to go through the Gemara is with the Mahalach of the Netziv. The Netziv, who brings the Shagas Aryeh in all his questions, the Shagas Aryeh has his own Mahalach through the Gemara, which I'm not going to lie, I didn't really understand. But the Netziv's Mahalach, it sat well with me. Basically, the way he understands our Mishnah is the Mishnah is discussing a question of when does something receive the din that it should have a din kedusha, meaning when is chal on this thing that it has a din kedusha, l'may nafkamina, common nafkamina. It doesn't need geniza. Does it not need geniza?
Putting other things on top.
Putting other things on top of it is a din of kedusha. The other thing that he talks about, and this is what's negea us, is does it have the din, at least as it pertains to the Chavdal and Sifrei Tanakh, that a person who touches what it's written on is metama biyadayim. We saw that there was a din tuma derabanan. The rabbis instituted really more as a shmira around the halachos of truma, right? Because what was happening is the animals were coming and eating the truma, and then they were eating up the klaf that all the svarim were written in. They therefore made a din derabanan that if it's going to be one of the Chavdal and Sifrei Tanakh, that it'll have a din of tuma derabanan. That's going to be the one that we're going to sort of work through here. There are other shaylas as well. There's a question about, right, there's a halacha of dvarim shebiksav yeta rishoy lemar bal peh. So that obviously only applies to Chavdal and Sifrei Tanakh. The question is if I'm reading from something that's not written in, let's say it's written in English. If I'm reading the translation of a stone chumash in English, am I reading the Torah or am I saying it bal peh? Depends. If it's okay to write such a thing in English, then I'm reading it biksav. If it's not considered written, then even though I am reading it off of a piece of paper, well, if the words that are on that paper halachically are not called written, then I'm being over on Dvarim Shabbat. But I don't want to complicate matters. But I'm just pointing out that the Mishnah is a simple Mishnah that one can read very quickly, but it really opens up sugyas. And we'll see at the end of our Gemara that even though the Tanakama is clearly discussing, let's say what I'm saying, that it's talking about the Kedusha of the Sefer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is also not talking about that. He's talking about translation for sure, meaning because the way he says it is, you cannot write even a Sefer Torah in any language other than Lashon HaKodesh and Yavanis. He's clearly talking about the permission to write it down, meaning to translate.
And the Mishnah has a severe difficulty on that mahalach that's not Sefer Torah, because it should say Ein bein svarim ela shasvarim nichtav b'chol lashon v'sefer Torah tefillin mezuzos ein nichtav ela ashuris.
Exactly,
It's
right.
like,
So
the
I'm
whole
so
Mishnah
that's
is out of kilter.
right. So I'm sort of pointing out that on the one hand, you start talking Sfarim, which sounds like Sefer Tanakh.
Right.
You end up talking about Ashuris, which sounds like it belongs with a Sefer,
Right.
and it
One
that
side
sort of
has a
creates the
logic
complication.
difficulty, and one side has a textual difficulty.
Yes, exactly.
You just said translate.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's doing a translation here.
The Gemara discusses.
The Gemara's, but no. With
With the Gemara going to translate?
no. But explain the question. I want to make sure I understand what you mean.
I think it's doing, if I first look at it, it sounds like transliteration. And with the word bracious, you write with Geisha letters.
Like Berai, like that.
Not in the beginning. When the Mishnah says Svarim can be written in any lashon, you're learning a translation or transliteration.
What does the word lashon mean? How do you understand it?
Letters,
Why?
because I saw Shuris the next line.
Okay. So Rashi says on Ashuris even he says lashon hakodesh.
What?
Rashi says Ashuris here means lashon hakodesh.
Not the letters.
Not the letters, not necessarily. Lashon HaKodesh is Hebrew.
What
We'll
would
call
be
Hebrew.
the advantage of Greek letters. There's an advantage of the Greek language that maybe it's a very good language that you could be exact.
Right, or it's
But what's the
beautiful.
advan- what's the advantage of Greek letters? That's the
Adarab, what we
Yeah.
will see in the Gemara, and this is why I'm asking, I wanted to clarify your question, is there is, right, exactly. I mean, there is a value to the Kedusha of a Ksav Ashuris,
Right.
even if you have no clue what it means, right? There's a value to the language of Lashon HaKodesh, and there's a value to the Ksav of Lashon HaKodesh, which is Ksav Ashuris.
Right.
So it could be pshat in the Mishnah is it's specifically saying that a Torah can be written in any language as long as the letters that are used are Ksav Ashuris. So I use an aleph, a beis, a gimel, and a daled to say, like I said
In
before,
the beginning.
companies or in the beginning or no, yeah, you could say in the beginning as long as the language is used, the letters are used.
like
that way.
in with an aleph and a nun.
Yes.
In the,
Yeah.
like
Yes,
that. That would
exactly.
allow-
Well, yes, that would be fine.
That's
like
transliteration.
Yiddish, like Yiddish
No,
did, and
it's not
Latino
transliteration.
That's
did.
not transliteration.
That's transliteration and translation
Wow.
because you're also using English. You're saying in the beginning. If you wrote Bereshis, right? Bereshis is the way it's said. That's the language. The writing system, the font, that can change, right? That might not be Ksav Ashuris. What I'm pointing out is that the writing system of Ksav Ashuris is Halik, meaning if you use that writing system, even if it's communicating, try to make a distinction here between a verbal communication, what you're hearing from what I'm saying, and a visual communication, what you're seeing in what I write. Right now, I'm looking at a Gemara that is written in Aramaic.
Yeah.
The language is Aramaic, but the Ksav, to keep things simple, is block letter Hebrew. We would call this Lashon Kodesh, right?
Yes.
Right. So this would have the Mila of being written properly, but we're not necessarily speaking in a holy language, right? Whereas, what would be an example of that is if when someone says in televisia with the Hebrew letters, right? They're using the Ksav of Hebrew, but they're not speaking Hebrew; they're speaking English, right? Understand? So that's a question that the Gemara is going to address about when our Mishnah is stating that Torah retains its kedusha even in another language. What does that mean? Tefillin and mezuzah only retain their kedusha when they are written in Hebrew and in Ksav Ashuris, meaning the way you would open up your tefillin and look at it. Whereas maybe Chaf Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, right? Bereshis all the way to the end. Maybe that has its kedusha even if it's written in English, and even when I say English, the language of English, as long as perhaps it's written in with the letters of Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. Does that make sense?
So when I read here in the art scroll, there is no difference between, instead of Ain Vein, if I say there is no difference, that's considered a translation.
That is a translation.
That's
correct.
a translation.
Yes.
And a transliteration is
Would be like me saying that it's like when a mourner who never spoke a word lick of Hebrew is saying Kaddish, and you hand him that piece of paper that says Yiskadal, that's a transliteration.
That's the translation.
That's getting you to say the language properly, but you're reading it from words that are written with a typeface, with a font that isn't the Aleph base.
We're right now talking the Mishnah as translation.
I'm saying Reb Shimon Gamliel is talking about translation. What I'm saying is that the Tanna Kama is talking just simply about the halacha of whether it can be, whether it retains its kedusha when you write it in that language.
Okay,
So,
I got it.
meaning the nafkamina of what I'm saying is that the stone chumash, okay, and not stone chumash, is the what's it called, the Septuagint or the King James Bible, without the Old Testament, the New Testament part. I'm saying just the Old Testament translated into English. Is that retain its kedusha or not? So the Tanna Kama says yes, it does, but only
assuming it's translated well.
correctly.
Yeah.
Correctly, yeah. Moshe talks about that. Yeah, exactly right. It would retain its kedusha. However, tefillin and mezuzah, if you wrote tefillin and mezuzah in English and you shoved it inside your tefillin, not only is you're not kosher, you could throw that in the garbage. It doesn't mean anything. Meaning what you have there doesn't have any kedusha. Okay, that's the way we're going to read. Not because I think that's the emes necessarily more than any other pshat. I think it's the easiest one to sort of go through the daf with, honestly. Otherwise, I think you could see even here before we haven't even read a line of the Gemara, you can see how this is negea many simanim in Shulchan Aruch. So that's what I meant when I said it's a 2-line Mishnah. You think it's easy, chick chak. But really, the emphasis is it's a complicated thing. Okay.
So we pass them like the Tanna Kama, but we don't.
So we'll get to that complicates matters because we have to know what they say. Okay. So just quick review. The Tanna Kama says you write any one of the Chaf Daled Sifrei Tanakh in any other language, it retains its kedusha. That's why we're reading it. And L'may nafkamina, if you touch it, you become tamei. Okay, and whereas tefillin and mezuzah, if you touch it, if it's written in English and you touch it, there's no tumah. But if you touch it and it's written in Hebrew, then there is a tumah. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, I don't even understand the conversation. Why are we talking about when it was written in English? You're not allowed to write it in English. It can only be written in Hebrew and, for some reason, as we'll see in the Gemara, ancient Greek. That's the Mishnah. Zata Gemara Astira. Well, first the Gemara says, let's continue with our pattern of Ein Bain, right? So Ein Bain means this is the only distinction. Right? The Gemara is going to be Medayik, Hala Teufern Begiden, Ulatam Esayadayim Zeves Eshav. Zata Gemara, that you're making the distinction between whether there's going to be a din tumah if it's written in a language other than Lashon HaKodesh. The Mashmo says is that in all other respects they're the same. So that means if you were to make a Sefer Torah and put one piece of cloth with another piece of cloth, when you connect it, it needs to be connected with an animal's gidin. Gidin is technically called a sinu, but really it's like a tendon ligament. Basically, it's using a physical part of the animal's body. And they are both similar or the same as it pertains to whether there is a din tumah, not necessarily when that tumah will apply, right? The way I'm explaining it, that's actually not true. So this is actually one of the parts of the Gemara where the way I'm learning isn't so gishmak, because the Gemara then comes in and says that they're exactly the same when it comes to the Tumas Yadayim. Well, that's not really 100% true, because really the Tumah of a Sefer Torah or the Chaf Daled Sefer Tanakh will apply even if it's written in English, whereas according to what I'm saying, Tefillin and Mezuzah will only apply if it's in Hebrew, but you could still explain the Gemara and it would be consistent. But either way, Zata Gemara, this next question is going to have 5 answers that will literally take us to the next Mishnah. Okay? Not complicated. Fun, actually. I just want to point out that it's really one question with 5 answers. What's the question? We have a Braisa Urimini. Urimino Mikro Shekosfu Targum. If I have something that was supposed to be written in Lashon HaKodesh, and I ended up writing it in an Aramaic, yeah? Or with Targum, I have something that's supposed to be written in Aramaic, and I'll explain what these mean in a second. Shekosfu Mikro, but I ended up writing it in Lashon HaKodesh. Uksav Ivri, or I wrote it in this other font, which, if you remember, Ksav Ivri came up in the Gemara on Daf Beis Amud Beis when we were talking about whether the endamem and the other enda letters were b'Mesorah or were they done by the Nevi'im. And without getting complicated, we saw over there the Ramban held that Luchas Rishonis was Ksav Ashuris, and then that was sort of hidden, and the Luchas Shnias were B'Ksav Ivri, and we did B'Ksav Ivri all the way up until Ezra, and then Ezra came along and he brought back the godless of Ksav Ashuri, which was why that's how we explained the Gemara that the Mem and the Samach were b'nei Sayu Omdim, even though Ksav Ivri, there is no Samach and Mem that is a circle. They're written in a different pattern. The only letter was an ayin that is a circle. But either way, so Ksav Ivri is this other type of acceptable way to write a Sefer Torah. We don't do it anymore. If you would see Ksav Ivri, I promise you it would look somewhere between hieroglyphics and Chinese. It looks impossible to read.
My son in high school learned all of Ksav Ivri, and then he was writing things in school. It was like his code.
It's basically a codex. I mean, wow. Okay. Yeah, some kids. My kids are having a hard time putting blocks together. His kids translating. His kids translating into 70. Okay.
He was born in school, so yeah. He signed all his papers, like his test papers.
Just to test his teachers. Yeah. Okay. Good for him. Okay, Mikra Shekos v'Targum, Targum Shekos v'Mikra, and Ksav Ivri. These 3 things, meaning they're done. The whole point here is none of these things are Ksav Ashuris and Lashon HaKodesh all the way through. Einai mitame esiyadayim achiach devenu b'Ksav Ashuris al hasefer ubidiyai. They are not mitame yadayim, and here's how my pshat in the Mishnah really is gishmak, because it's mamish a question on Tumas Yadayim. You hear over here, if you write it, meaning, and again, let's work it out. What would be Mikra Shekos v'Targum? Any pasuk in the Torah. It's supposed to be written in Lashon HaKodesh. It's supposed to be written b'Ksav Ashuris, and you went ahead and decided to use, block letters. You did Aramaic. You changed a word that would be, let's say you wrote the word chachma, chaf, ches, chaf, mem, hey, and you wrote chachma with an aleph. Whatever. You figured out a way to write it in a language that it shouldn't be. Or you wrote it in English, wisdom. Yeah? With Targum Shekos v'Mikra, or something that should be b'Targum. It should have been written, translated. So where's an example of that? So the rabbi went ahead a little bit. So the pasuk says by Lavan and Yaakov that Yakar Sedusa was what he called the pile of stones, And Yaakov then called it Gilad, Galed, right? So over there, Galed is Lashon HaKodesh, Ikar Sadusa is Aramaic. So you do see that there are times, and you also have in Sefer Daniel, Rashi brings over here, and in Ezra and Nehemiah, that you have Aramaic written in because they were already starting to speak in Babel, in that language. Oh, yeah, exactly.
And a little bit in Sefer Yomi. So you have all three sections.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, but you got it. Good job. Yeah.
Okay.
So Lamaisi, you have places where Tanakh should be written in Aramaic. Let's say you went ahead and decided to translate the entire thing and put that into a sefer. And then the last one, Ksav Ivri, which we mentioned. If you did any of these things and then you touched it, the halacha is you are not tamei. Eina mitam es yadayim ad sheyichdavenu b'ksav ashuris. It all has to be written b'ksav ashuris al hasefer on klaf ubediyai with the correct type of halachic ink. This is a kasha on our Mishnah. Why? Because our Mishnah is clearly stating in the Tanakama that I can write any one of the Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh in any language, and it's seemingly in any font, and the halacha would be that there's a tumah, that it has a kedusha. That's what the Mishnah is stating, the way we're learning. So that's a question. This question is going to be the question that we're going to address in the Gemara. The Amar Rava, so Amar Rava says the first teretz. What's his teretz? Loi kasha, and this is the rabbi's teretz. Kan begufan shalanu, kan begufan shalahen. The first answer is, when we're saying in the Mishnah that it can be written in any language, we mean any verbal language. But the Mishnah, of course, is still only talking about where you wrote it using the Hebrew alphabet, right? So kan in our Mishnah, where it's still going to retain its kedusha and have a din tumah, even though it's written in another language, it means that it is writing it with an aleph base, but saying the words in another language. And this is, to use all of your examples, this would be truly right, exactly a transliteration where the word it does. Okay, wonderful. It's a transliteration. So the classic example in my mind is the Heter of Rav Moshe by Chalav Yisrael, where he refers to the milk that we call Chalav Stam as Chalav companies, and he writes companies out. To me, I always find that humorous. I have no clue why. Companies, as if like companies is not a word in English called companies, but it's a technical word called companies. But okay, fine. So that's.
Because Yiddish always did that.
Of course, well, that's what Yiddish is by definition. It's combining Hebrew, English, and German into some sort of exactly. Kan begufan shalahan. Whereas the Mishnah in Yadayim that the Gemara brought, that's talking about written literally in another language, meaning another alphabet, another font, and therefore it's going to be not tamei until you write it b'ksav ashuris, right? So that's the chiluk. So the problem is, Abaye says that's a wonderful teretz. But mayu kimto lehahi. You're saying Mishnah Yadayim is talking about begufan shalahan that was written in another alphabet. My area mikra shekasuv targum v'targum shekasuv mikra. So then why did it have to mention anything about changing the language? It could have been afilu mikra shekasuv mikra. It could have been written properly, meaning the words that you were stating, the verbal expression that was there is the same. V'targum shekasuv targum. And it could have not worked. Why? You could have still made the distinction and said over there that it's not going to become tamei until you have ksav ashuris. If the only distinction is what letters were actually written, then why even mention the change in language? Again, language is what you're hearing, and the alphabet is what you're writing. Right? So Gemara says the haktani ad sheyichtevenu ashuris ala sefer b'diyai. If the whole question there comes down to whether it's written in the right font or not, the right alphabet, then who cares what language it is? Even if you had written the language entirely proper, it still would be a problem, meaning it would not have a din kedusha that there should be a din tumah. So the Gemara says therefore a second teretz. Elo loy kosha harabanon ha Rav Shimon Gamliel. A second teretz. What's the simple answer here? Well, didn't our Mishnah tell us two opinions? The Tanakama said you can write it in any language, and Rav Shimon Gamliel said no, you can only write it in Lashon HaKodesh and Yavanis. And the Gemara wants to say that the Mishnah in Yadayim, which says it can only be written in Ksav Ashuris, of course, that's Rav Shimon Gamliel, who has a much more limiting understanding of what will create kedusha in a sefer. Gemara says, Rav Shimon Gamliel, the obvious teretz, meaning what do you mean? Rav Shimon Gamliel, his whole chiddush is not only Lashon HaKodesh, but also Yavanis. For the Gemara, Ha'ika Yavanis, he mentions Yavanis, and this Mishnah in Yadayim doesn't mention anything about Yavanis. So what are you going to say? It's lav dafka? No, obviously it's saying very specific. Savashuris. So that's a very shver havamina. But okay, fine. That's the second potential teretz. Ella, here we're already up to the third teretz, so 60% done. So you're good. Don't worry about it. Ella loikasha kan besvarim kan betfilin mezuzais. Meaning what? We're saying that when we're talking about tefillin and mezuzais, that's when we say that in order for there to be a kedusha, the kedusha will only apply if it's b'ksav ashuris. And when our Mishnah says that there's no kedusha. But there is kedusha even when it's in a different language. That's talking about chav dalet svarim, which, by the way, is how we understood the chachamim. The way we understood the Chachamim was they were making a distinction between Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, which can be written in any language, and Tefillin and Mezuzah, which can only be written in Ksav Ashuris. And all we're stating here is that this brisa is only talking about Tefillin and Mezuzahs. And just parenthetically, Tefillin and Mezuzah is my time. And what is the reason then why Tefillin and Mezuzah can only be written in Ksav Ashuris and Lashon HaKodesh? Mishum Dichsiv Behu V'Hayu Advarim Ha'ela V'Hayu. We darshan to mean V'Havayason Yehu, that they should be in their original, meaning basically that they can only be written in Lashon HaKodesh and used Ksav Ashuris. But then the Gemara says, 1 second, if that's the answer, that the Mishnah in Yadayim is talking about Tefillin and Mezuzahs and not talking about Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, read the Gemara, it says in there that there's Targum that should be written Mikra, and Mikra that can be written Targum. My Targum shekosu Mikra Ika. I understand Bishlama Torah Ika. If we were talking about in the Torah, I can find a scenario where there's Targum that needs to be written Targum, and you messed it up by writing it in Hebrew. How? Yogar Sadusa, like we mentioned before, by Lavan and Yaakov. However, Elahacha, my Targum Ika, what pasuk in Tefillin and Mezuzah should be written in Targum, meaning in another language? Is there any example in the entire the Dalit Parshias that you'll have where you should have been writing it in, I don't know, Aramaic, and really you ended up making a mistake, so to speak, and wrote it in Lashon HaKodesh? The entire thing is in Lashon HaKodesh. So therefore, the Gemara comes off of that. Lamaisa, I remember a long time ago, I heard that I think it's Gemara's Totafos is another language.
Right.
I mean, so Lamaisa, I'm not 100% sure if
It's brought down by someone.
it does?
Yeah,
Okay,
I could find who. I think in one of the notes that question.
it's an African language. Afriki, I think is. It's a Rashi, I think, on Totafos and Chumash, that he says that Afriki means it's another language. So maybe I can't imagine what we mean over here is that it's specifically Aramaic. I think it just means any other language. Okay, there we go.
That question.
Yeah. Okay. So so I don't exactly know why the Gemara doesn't want to rely on that as the pasuk, and Totafos would be in both Tefillin and Mezuzah. So it's not even like it would only be in one of them.
Yep.
Okay, but either way, so we come off of that because it doesn't really fit the Mishnah in Yadayim so well. So we have 3 pshatim that
when they say Targum, they literally mean Aramaic.
Right. It could very well mean that that's what it means.
Yeah.
But in our Mishnah,
But we're trying to explain the price.
a Mishnah Yadayim. Yeah. Gemara calls it a Bryce. I don't know why, but okay. Okay, so we're up to the 4th teretz, 80%.
They never learned Yadayim, so they figured it
Yeah, there we go. It must be a Bryce. Elalai kasha kan b'Megilla kan b'Sfarim. Very interesting chiddush. The Gemara wants to say with a Mishnah in Yadayim that says in order for it to have a din kedusha, it needs to be b'Ksav Ashuris and b'Lashon HaKodesh. That's talking about Megillas Esther, and our Mishnah is talking about all other Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh. It's very interesting. Now, Lamaisa, my timer, why would you say Megillah has to be written b'Ksav Ivri, right? And b'Ksav Ashuris and the Lashon Ivris, Lashon HaKodesh, my timer, because the pasuk says Kiksavam ukilshoinam, which is very interesting. Kiksavam ukilshoinam is actually not written by the Chiyuv to write a Megillah. It's actually written by the letters that were sent out by Achashverosh, right? That were sent out to all of Paros and Modai. So how could you bring a raya from here? In fact, I think the pasuk by is Kiksavam ukizmanam. Kiksavam ukizmanam is the pasuk that is going by when they sent when it's talking about the mitzvah to write the Megillah. In which case, then you really only have a raya that the ksiva, which L'chora is referring to the Ksav Ashuris, and not necessarily to Lashon HaKodesh, which would be sort of in line with the chiluk we saw earlier, which is as long as you're using Ksav Ashuris. But the Gemara is bringing this pasuk. It could be it's a Girsa Shaila in the Gemara. He changes it.
Changes it. The aleph with the bracket.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Makes exactly that change.
I didn't even see that. That's very good. Okay. Yeah. Very, very good. Okay. So Lamaisa Fred the Gemara. Okay, it's fine. So Megillah needs to be, we'll assume, in Lashon HaKodesh and Ksav Ashuris, and that's the explanation of the Mishnah Yadayim. And our Mishnah is talking about all other Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh. And really, when the Chachamim said that Svarim, it was Lav Dafka, all the Svarim, it meant 23 out of the 24 Svarim are going to retain their Kedusha, even if they're written in another language. And the Mishnah Yadayim, only if it's written b'Ksav Ashuris and if it's in Hebrew.
And it's funny, though. It's funny that we use Kiksavam to say it must be in Lashon HaKodesh.
Right.
Because basically
over there it was talking about multiple languages.
All the languages, therefore we learn from that it must be in Lashon HaKodesh.
Yeah, and Echanami. Kiksavam
backwards Russia.
Yeah. Which shows you the Messiah that we have, obviously. Yeah. Okay. So Fred the Gemara, 1 second. Wonderful teretz. My Targum shekos for Mikra Ika. Where in the Megillah do you have a scenario where it's supposed to be written not in Lashon HaKodesh that it would fit the Mishnah Yadayim's description of talking about Megillah? The Gemara says 2 potential answers. Amra Papa, v'nishma piskam hamelech, when it's talking about the decree, the what's the decree? It was the decree of the Melech. He could have used the word Dvar HaMelech. Now, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Omer V'chol Anoshim Yitnu Yikar LeBaleim is talking about by Memuchan's suggestion that we have to, feminists over here, we can't let these women get too whatever. So therefore, he said we got to make sure the husbands are treated with respect. And instead of saying covet, it used the worst lashon of Yikar, which we'll use nowadays. Maybe it even, Yakar is it's an Aramaic word meaning covet. So the bottom line is you do have two psukim in the Megillah, at least, where it's written in Aramaic, or part of it is in Aramaic, that it would now fit the Mishnah in Yadayim that would say that the tum is only there if it's written b'ksav ashuris. So the this teretz the Gemara doesn't have any other problems with, which would mean that really this is a good teretz. The Rav Ashi is going to say a fifth teretz. This teretz is going to start the discussion of Talmud Amelech. Oh, you're missing the best part. I wish I would have known. You got to leave me a heads up when you leave, so I can get to I can get to the highlight stuff.
8:15. I'm leaving. In 2 days, it's going to go back to how it was.
Mitzvah. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. It's okay too. We'll have the recording. Hopefully, I'll try to get it up early enough, and then yeah. Okay. Even though the mice, you're the technical guy, you're supposed to do it. Okay. Rav Ashi says a fifth teretz. How do I explain the stira in the Mishnah and the Mishnah in Yadayim? Rav Ashi Amar Kitanyo Hahi. The Mishnah in Yadayim is talking about Shar Svarim. Is talking about Shar Svarim, meaning it is talking about Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh. How does that work out? If it's talking about Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, sorry, not Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, it's talking only about Nach. The Mishnah in Yadayim is only talking about Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and La'olam, it's not even Bechlal talking about
Torah
at all. Chamisha Chumshei Torah. What's it talking about? Just Nach. And our Mishnah, when it says that there's a Kedusha, that's the Chachamim. Rav Shimon Gamliel argues and says that you're allowed to write it in any language, only allowed to write it in Hebrew or Yavanis. So wait 1 second, how does that fix anything? So I have a Mishnah that says you can write the entire Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh in any language. I have a sheet of Rav Shimon Gamliel in our Mishnah who says you can't write it only, all of Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh can only be written in Hebrew or Greek. And now I have a Mishnah in Yadayim that says you have to write Nach in Lashon Kodesh in order for there to be a Din Tumah. So that means, who is that? Which opinion is that? So the Gemara says, Reb Yehuda. Who's Reb Yehuda? So we'll see. The Tanya Tefillin and Mezuzah say Nichtavan El Ashuris. So first we have a brisa that says that if you have Tefillin and Mezuzah, they can only be written in Ashuris. But Rabbi Seinu, which is referring to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, Yitiru Yavana said no, it can even be written in Yavanas. For the Gemara, V'haksiv how can you tell me that Tefillin and Mezuzah can be written in any language other than Ashuris? There's a drasha of V'hayu to teach me that it can only be written in Ashuris, so that can't be pshat in what that brisa means. Therefore, Ela Ema Svarim Nichtavim B'chol Lashon. All the Chav Dalet Sifrei Tanakh can be written in any language. That'll be the Tanakama. But Rabbi Seinu and Rav Shimon Gamliel is arguing and says Hitiru Yavanas, and says no, you could even do it in Yavanas. That doesn't make any sense. Hitiru is mashma. Hitiru Michlal the Tanakama Aser, which is not true. The Tanakama was saying an all-encompassing statement that all languages are going to be okay. Ela Ema Rabbi Seinu. And this is now the brisa, meaning what? The Tanakama says you can write all the svarim in any language. Comes along, Rav Shimon Gamliel says no. They are only allowed to be written, right? Meaning, and what is it talking about? So now that's where everything comes out. Now, why was that the case? We'll see in a second. That's the mice of the Talmud Amelech. We'll get to it in a minute. But let's just understand the Gemara's fifth teretz. What was the kasha? The kasha was that it says in the Mishnah that you're going to have a tumah even if it's written in English, even if it's written in any other language. And I have a Mishnah in Yadayim that's mashma that tumah is not going to exist unless it's written b'ksav l'shuris and b'lashon hakodesh. We saw 5 terutzim. I'm not going to review them. You could listen to the video after to figure them out. What's this teretz of Rav Ashi? Very simple. The Mishnah in Yadayim is talking about a completely unique shita, a das yachid of Reb Yehuda in Rav Shimon Gamliel. He understands that when Rav Shimon Gamliel says that Yavanis, you can translate it into Yavanis, he was saying that is only true for Chamisha Chumshei Torah, right? And therefore, this brisa, this Mishnah in Yadayim is talking about Nevi'im and Ksuvim, that they must be written in Lashon HaKodesh, and there's no hetzah to write them in any other language. And not only that, when they're written in Ksav Ashuris, there's a din tumah. But he would agree that Chamisha Chumshei Torah can be written in Lashon HaKodesh and Yavanis, and both of those, if you touch them, would have a din tumah. And then there's Rav Shimon Gamliel of our Mishnah, not this Rav Yehuda's strange shita, who holds that no, what we're talking about is Rav Shimon Gamliel says you can write it in all Chavdalit Sifrei Tanakh in Lashon HaKodesh and in Yavanis. And then there's the Tanakama who says, no, everything can be written not only in Yavanis, not Lashon HaKodesh, it can be written in any language, and it applies to all Chavdalit Sifrei Tanakh. And in all scenarios, there's going to be a Dim Tumah. So really, it's almost like there's really three Shitas. There's Tanakama, Rav Shimon Gamliel proper, and then the Rav Shimon Gamliel of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, why, according to this sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, did Rav Shimon Gamliel say you are only allowed to do Yavanis in Chamisha Chumshei Torah? This was because of the story with Talmei HaMelech. What is the story with Talmei HaMelech? Before we get to it, for those people who don't know, because I honestly didn't know until I looked it up, who is Talmei HaMelech? Just to give some context, Talmei HaMelech lived roughly 200-300 years before the change of BC, whatever. And in that time, he was the son of the original Talmei. The original Talmei was the one who took over after Alexander, the great Alexander of Macedon, died. He was one of dozens of potential followers. His kingdom, the Greek kingdom, was so large and vast that everyone each grabbed a piece. So he grabbed Egypt, which contained in it Alexandria, which is named after, of course, Alexander. Yeah, Alexandria was a great city. Alexandria was known, it was a Greek city, even though it was in Egypt, and it was known to be like a very educated sort of a city where Chachamim came in, and I'm talking about Chacham and Chachmei HaUmos, where they would study philosophy, and they would study, I believe, under Ptolemy II, who we're referring to now, he was like is during his reign that Euclidean geometry, Euclid lived in Alexandria under his time. So I mean,
there was also a great astronomer named Ptolemy, and you shouldn't confuse.
Not yet, unrelated, yeah.
So when Alexandrian Empire fell apart, there was the Seleucid Empire,
right? Which are the Greeks?
Right.
I mean, what we call the Greeks. Right. Yeah.
But the Greeks that were in Egypt are called the Ptolemaic.
Right. So that's Antiochus versus right. Okay. So Lamaisa, you have this Ptolemy II. He's called Ptolemy of Philadelphus. I don't know. I'm sure you can explain why that was his name. But the point is that don't please. Okay. So
the city was Philadelphia.
Yeah, probably.
That's why Philadelphia's name.
Yeah, exactly right. So Lamaisa, you have this Talmei HaMelech. Now, there's a story. I'm going to quote it because I wrote it down. Written by a fellow. There's a letter of Aristeas. The letter of Aristeas was a letter purported to have been written legitimately between, it seems, two Greek Jews.
Professor Lyman talks about the letter of Aristeas in one of his lectures.
Oh, really? Because a lot of historians seem to claim that it's made up.
Well, he talks about it. I'm not saying he says it's real.
Right. So, and there's actually a Hebrew translation of the letter of Aristeas, which Josephus based his entire explanation of the story on this letter of Aristeas. And the letter of Aristeas, there's an actual translation by someone by the name of Azariah de Rossi. Azariah de Rossi lived at the same time of the Maharal and the Beis Yosef.
Right.
Azariah de Rossi, Me'orei Naim,
Yeah.
the Imrei Bina, not to be confused with the Me'orei Naim of Chassidus Shalor, of the Talmidim of the Besht, and not to be confused with the Imrei Bina from the Miyazde Yerushalayim, who were contemporaries of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Shmuel Salant and Bechulu Bechulu. He wrote a sefer called Me'orei Naim, and then he came out with a sefer called Imrei Bina. Imrei Bina was filled with Bepashtus Apikorsis, meaning he was a Yodea Torah for sure. He felt that this letter of Aristeas needed to be written, and so that Chachamim, Talmidei Chachamim, should have shaykhs to it. It's hard for even us to understand what does it mean to be apikorsis in those times. Meaning, he clearly believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was a shomer Torah mitzvahs, but he was
in Italy. He wasn't like in the main group of Rishonim that
exactly.
Other strange views.
So either way, so the Maharal put him in Chayrim. He never got the Beis Yosef to sign off on it, but he put him in Chayrim. But the point is, he translated this letter of Aristeas, and it is available. You can literally go into the library, and maybe not here library, but you can go into the libraries and see it. But the point is, this letter of Aristeas essentially laid out the story that more or less is how Josephus has it in his, I think it's his 11th or 12th in his book over there in chapter 2. I looked it up last night. And the point is you read it over there, and it looks pretty different than our story. Meaning the general points are the same, that there were 70 tzaddikim, and put them in a room, and they came out with the same thing. But the point is, over there, they made it a big simcha. Like they make it out to be like a huge simcha. Whereas here in our Gemara, and we know in Megillah's Tainus, it's maybe one of the reasons why we fast on Asar B'Tevis, because it happened on Ches Tevis, Ches Tes, and Yud. So it's you have to sort of work out exactly whether it was a Yom Simcha or was a Yom Evil. But the point is, this was Talmei HaMelech. So what happened in the story of Talmud HaMelech. With that type of an introduction, I hope the story pays off. Yep. Umishum Ma'aseh the Talmud HaMelech, Netanya Ma'aseh the Talmud HaMelech, Shekines Shivim Shnayim Zkenim. Took 72 Zkenim, meaning I think even already in the letter of Aristaeus, it says he took 6 from each tribe, which is also a shaila because you have to know were the 12 tribes at that point in existence or not in existence. But okay, fine. 12 tribes times 6, you have 72. He put them in 72 different houses. He didn't even tell them what they were doing there. They probably thought, I mean, from the way the Gemara is telling it, it's very clear that they should be scared, meaning the Talmaian king in that time is saying, I need to take the 72 biggest Jews. Can you imagine? All the Gedalim, puts them in a house, doesn't tell them what they're doing there. He went then in by each one of them. Rabchem is mashma that he didn't believe the Torah is emes. He was saying, tell me about this Torah that your Rabbi Moshe wrote, right?
Because he's a pagan.
Yeah, of course. So Lamaisa, he says, I want you to write it down. So the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu dropped in a suggestion into the minds of each one of these 72 and not only did they get a general did they get the inspiration to make shinuyim in the ksav, and each shinui we'll explain in a moment, but they made the exact same shinuyim. So it wasn't just simply that the first thing you could say, all right, no, 72 Gedolim decided, maybe I need to make a shinu here and there. That in and of itself isn't that big a deal. To say, though, that each one of the shinuyim they made was kiksavam u kil shaynam, mamish the same, that is already a peladiga thing. Now, well, let's go through it. So I have wrote them down over here on a page. You can look at it, not look at it, whatever, but I think it's easier to understand because the Gemara does not mention the psukim. The Gemara mentions the fake psukim. So it's hard sort of to know what the fake psukim are coming. Of course, it assumes you know Tanakh. Right. And by the way, my hand's up in the air. I didn't know it. I had to look it up. So, and don't think I spent time writing and typing in Hebrew. I found these on copy and paste these. Okay. So what does it say? So the first thing that they changed was the Kasvu, the famous one, Elohim bara Bereshis. They changed it to make it sound like God was actually the one creating the world, rather than Bereshis bara Elohim, which would have without Torah Sheba'al Peh. And again, the theme in a lot of these ideas here, you have to sort of work it out. I'm not going to be able to explain every single one of them, but the theme here is that the Shinoi was either in order to prevent the copy of the Torah on record from containing apikarsis, or something, but the key was they didn't make any shinoi that was not true, although it's hard to say that there's one shinoi that they did which is mamash sheker, but the point is that they were done in some sort of an Eis Lasos LaHashem type of a scenario that we didn't want this Talmud HaRasha, who was a Rasha, he married his sister, he was a big mashches. We didn't want this guy to potentially make problems for the Jews any more than they already had, and so therefore they made these changes. So Elokim bara Bereshis instead of Bereshis bara Elokim, that's the obvious one. E'eseh Edem Adam B'Tzelem Ub'Demos, the 3 shinuyim there. Instead of Naaseh, it's E'eseh. Instead of B'Tzalmenu Kidmusenu, it's B'Tzelem Ub'Demos. Again, this way one couldn't think that there's more than one person Kiviyachol creating. It's only one Hashem. The simple read in the pasuk would have been that Hashem stopped working on the 7th, but he did not stop working on the 7th, so to speak. He stopped working on the 6th. But we understand in Drasha to understand that although he stopped doing the malacha, but on Shabbos there was menucha, and there's something called menucha that is a part of Sheishas Yimei Breishis, or the Shivas Yimei Breishis really, but there's something called menucha, but that wouldn't have been something that Talmud would have understood, and that could have become a problem. A Zachar unikeva bar oy instead of a loikosvu bar It could have said, it should have said bar which is the pasuk. Right, Zachar unikeva bar Here the issue is whether Adam and Chava were created in one shot versus whether they were created separately. So bar is mashma that they were created separately. He didn't want them to think. He didn't want Talmud and those people to think that they were created separately. So therefore bar that they were created one body and shtei dai partzufim. Because the problem really is you have a stira in psukim. Yeah. It's the stira that was problematic, and he didn't want it to be a bezayin to the Torah that it should look like the Torah is inconsistent. Then the pasuk says, "Hava nerdav nivla sham svasam." This is talking about the daraflaga. Going to, let's go down and let's change the language. Now, nerdav nivla is mashma similar to nasa adam. That it's mashma that Hashem is sort of doing it with other people, so to speak. Obviously, that's not the case. So they changed it to Hava Erdo ve'evla sham sifasam. Yeah, fine. The next pasuk is by Sarah. This is the one that I think
it's a little bit like what Unkelos does. That he takes away certain expressions that you could have trouble with.
Could have a trouble with.
Like Hashem has a body.
He changes it right. I mean, sometimes he changes it in a way you're like, I don't know why he's doing that, but yeah, and that's usually where you can say it's Vartara. But yeah, so the next one is V'titzchak Sarah B'kirba Leimar. So we know that the story is that when Avram was told he was going to have a baby, he also left, right? Sarah left, but the Chumash says V'titzchak Sarah B'kirba that she did it B'kirba. There's a lot of different shatim here. I like the shot of the Torah Tzmim on this. Torah Tzmim says that Titzchak Sarah B'kirba, he changed that to V'titzchak Sarah B'kroiveha, in front of her friends. Why? Because Talmud wouldn't have understood how the Torah can say that she laughed B'kirba. This is a little bit like what we saw earlier about how did we know that Esther was written Baruch HaKodesh, that Haman thought Beliboy. How did Sarah know that it was Baruch HaKodesh? This person, Talmud, was an Apikoros, who's an atheist. He doesn't believe that. He says it was Moshe's Torah, not Hashem's Torah. So he wouldn't have been able to wrap his head around the idea of how could the Torah be writing like this. This is what would be like a chutzpah to write it in. So this is the only one I think that is mamish not. All of the other ones you can explain that the change is true. It's just we're trying to change the intent that mistaken understanding one could have. Here, where Mom is saying that no, she did it amongst her friends or relatives, that clearly isn't the case.
But you notice they chose something that the nikud is all they really changed. So
the kroveha, right. Correct. That's true.
They didn't literally change a word. They changed the Masorah.
Right. Which, by the way, it's possible that you're right. When they So when they translated it into English, they translated it that way. Right. Man, that's a nice shot. Maybe it could be that if with those nekudas b'shemas Hashem, you could say that maybe Anachanami, you could read it that way,
and it's less of a lie.
Right.
Meaning, This is the text.
That's good. I didn't think about it. It's very good. Yeah, I like that. Okay. The Gemara says, what's the next one? The pasuk says, "B'soydam al tavei nafshi b'kol al tafted k'voidi ki ba'apam hargu ish u'b'ritzoydim akru shar." This is the pasuk by Shimon and Levi when they were being described. So the pasuk should have said, "Ki ba'apam hargu ish," in their anger they killed a man. We're talking about Shechem and the whole story over there with Hamar, right? B'tzoydim akru shar and u'b'ritzoydim, akru shar, that they took out Shur. So 1 second. So the question is like this: why did he change it? What did he change it to? It says over here, "Ki ba'apam hargu shar," they killed a shar, right? Not an ish. U'b'ritzoydim akru avos, and they put a new word in. Avos just means like a feeding trough of some type. But the point is, we didn't want it to look like he killed a man. The very big question on this one, I don't have a good answer, is if Talmud has an explanation of the entire Torah, don't you think you need to change it also by the whole story? I mean, Lamaisa, the story happened, he killed people, right? So what are you telling me over here? What do you see over here? You see that even in the times of the Greeks, they only read the headlines, right? They didn't read the actual article, because if you read the article, you see that the headline says, whatever, you got the idea. Fine. The pasuk says, "Vayikach Moshe es ishlev es banav yirkvei al chamar." When Moshe and his wife and his children came back from Midian, they came back on a chamar. Now, a chamar, to someone who's uninitiated, will think that that's a very lowly animal for the Mashiach to be coming on. But Mashiach needs to be coming on a chamar. So in order so that they shouldn't say about that he wasn't the chashuv leader, they changed it to Vikach Moshe Seishlev as one of year Kivem al Noisib b'nei Adam. He changed it. Instead of coming on a chamar, he should have been driving in a Tesla, or he should have been driving in a fancy car. So therefore he changed it.
And Noisib b'nei Adam sounds strange. The Greek word. In other words,
is it? Yeah.
Hebrew for a Greek word,
meaning
like we say in English, a people mover. It was an expression.
Meaning whatever the Greek word for Nosei b'nei Adam was. Yeah. Right. It could be it was a tax. Whatever the word is, right? Okay. U'Moshe b'nei Yisrael asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim. So here there's two changes. Let's look at the pasuk inside. The pasuk says U'Moshe b'nei Yisrael asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim shloshim shana v'armei shana. This is a famous thing that it says that the Golus Mitzrayim is going to be 430 years. Which, if you do the math, we were only in Mitzrayim for 210 years, which means we're missing 220 years. So where are the 220 years? So we know in Medrash that it's the 30 years counted from before, 30 years before he was born by Bris Ben Absarim till the time Yitzchak was born. And from the time Yitzchak was born till the end of the Galus was another 100 years, and that's how you get the 430. But Talmud wasn't going to believe that, so therefore, what did they change it to? They changed it to Moshe b'nei Yisrael asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim u'b'shara ratzos arba miyoshana. So there's two shinuyim here. One, 430 to 400, and two, that instead of saying that we were b'Mitzrayim for 430 years and have to explain it using midrashim, they just sort of added in b'shara ratzos to make the math simple, and therefore they won't have problems because they'll be able to do the math also. V'yishlach as tuti b'nei Yisrael ve'el zatuti b'nei Yisrael le'shalach yadai. So here's the pasuk. What does it say? Did I skip one?
No, you could.
Or did I just?
Nari.
Okay. V'yishlach as Nari is by Nadav ve'Avihu. This is talking about by who are the ones who are going to be bringing the karbanos. V'yishlach as Nari b'nei Yisrael v'yalu oilas v'yizbechu zvachim shlom al Hashem parim ve'al atzilei b'nei Yisrael le'shalach yadai. So this is talking about Nari. Nari implies that we're talking about young little children Shuvim, but really it was not the Vavi when this came in. Therefore, in order to change it, we changed Nare to Zatuti. Zatuti is a word that means Chashuv. And then therefore, once we changed it over there, we changed Atzile also, even though Atzile would have been appropriate. So therefore it says, Vayishlach Zatuti b'nei Yisrael, Vel Zatuti b'nei Yisrael, Leishalach Yodai. Amid Beis. The next pasuk, we're almost done with the psukim here. It says, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, so it says over here that Moshe is claiming to Hashem, I never benefited from Klal Yisrael, I never took even a donkey. So what was the concern? The concern was that maybe Talmud will say, yeah, Chamor you took, maybe you took other things. So therefore they changed it, I didn't take a single thing, not even a little nothing. Therefore it was more as a covenant for Moshe Rabbeinu, again, to say, second time you see where second we see Chamar, and the second time you see that Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's funny, I find it interesting that by both of the times by Moshe Rabbeinu, the word that we're changing is the word Chamar. We didn't want to have the word Chamar associated with Moshe Rabbeinu. Twice already we did it. Asher chalak Hashem Elokecha itam lahayr l'chol ha'amim. What's that pasuk? The pasuk is a longer pasuk. What does the pasuk say? What's that?
No.
Oh, okay. Pasuk says, "Peintiso einecha ashmayma v'reisas Hashem shaseirecha sakacham l'kol tzva shemayim." We're talking about the sun and the moon and the stars. The sun and the moon and the stars were handed out. So what does it sound like? It sounds like Hashem's giving permission to the Goyim to be able to do Avodah Zarah. And then the pasuk continues and it says, they'll go and they'll serve it and bow down to it. Almost as if the sun, the moon, and the stars created themselves without my permission. So you have two problems in the pasuk. One, it's mashma Hashem's okay with Avodah Zarah. Two, it's mashma that he didn't have control over the sun, the moon, and the stars. So therefore, what did he do? He just changed the whole thing, and he says, "Asher chalak Hashem lokecha oisam." Instead of lechol ha'amim, leha'ir lechol ha'amim. He added that word in, which makes much more sense for them because now it's just saying that the sun, moon, and the stars were there to give light to the goyim. And then the pasuk, when it continued and says vayelech, it's vayelech v'yavel elokim acherim asher lo yitzivisi la'avdam, that I did not command of them for them to bow down to them, but not Asher Tzivisi, that the moon and the stars themselves went against my ratzon. What was the other one? V'kosvu. Here there's no pasuk here, but it's really just one word. It says in the Torah that there are 4 animals that are not kosher. 3 of them chew their cud but don't have hooves, and one of them has hooves but doesn't chew it. One of the ones that doesn't have hooves but chews its cud is called an arneves. We'll translate it as a rat. The Kosveloy, instead of saying Arneves, it's wrote as Tziras HaRaglayim, the one who has, I don't know what the English example that would be, but Tziras HaRaglayim, it has short legs, long legs, whatever it means. Veloy Kosveloy as Arneves. Now, why did it not write Arneves? Her name was Arneves. Now, her name wasn't actually Arneves. Her name was what the equivalent of a rabbit is in that language. In Greek, it would be whatever it was, and therefore they didn't want to change it. That the Jews are laughing at me, which is a very funny cheshbon that Talmud would have thought, as if
think of Donald Trump, like someone who's not that smart, who fulminates, like it's really, and I'm not opposed to Donald Trump, but I'm just saying,
but the problem is Talmud HaMelech. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but Talmud HaMelech was not a fool. He was a very successful man. He was a genius, really. I mean, he was a lover of academia. Maybe not a genius, but he certainly had an appreciation for Chacham. He was not someone who
he created the Academy at Alexandria, the library. So he had his heart. He
clearly, he was maybe a bad guy and a mushkas beyond description. But to say that he's someone who would foolishly read the words. Now, to me, when I just think about the story, we'll read the Gemara a little weiter in a moment. But to me, when I think about the story, it makes me think of. And I don't know if this brought anywhere, but the question that's asked is, how do you really square up the historical documents that seem to imply that this was a Yom Simcha by the Jews, meaning the day when there was gifts sent by Talmud HaMelech to the Kohen Gadol at the time, when you come to that. If you read through the story, it's
like anything else. Some Jews were happy, some were sad.
That could very well be the pshat.
In hindsight, we're all sad,
right?
Because of hindsight is 2020.
That could very well be. But then the question is what is it that we're sad about? Meaning, again, we discussed this a little bit the other day. Meaning, are you going to tell me that the art scroll translating it into English is like Talmud translating it into Greek? Whatever you'll say about art scroll, if you think maybe it's better not to have so much easily accessible translation, the harbatzas hatayra that came because, I mean, let's be honest, we wouldn't be sitting here if it wouldn't be for art scroll. It wouldn't be for a guy who was writing invitations, decided, you know what, maybe I need a Megillah Esther. If it wouldn't have been for that, we wouldn't be sitting here with art scrolls and whatever it is. So to say that translation was a bad thing is very hard to say.
You can't say we wouldn't be sitting here.
Well, maybe you and I might not have been, but we certainly wouldn't have at least Stefanski and all of his great things. They're unbelievable. Thank God. So the question is, so what really was the darkness that came? Because it says there was a choshech for 3 days. I was thinking, I mean, to me, it's pashut. Is that when was this happening? This was about 200 years or 250 years before the change, when the Septuagint was done. The Septuagint was done only on Chamisha Chumshei Torah, at least according to our Gemara. So that means that, but if you were to go online now and look for the Septuagint, they'll have much more than the 5 books of Moses. They'll have they have Nach, they have other things.
Yeah.
That was done, I think, maybe 100 or 150 years later, or may have been done piecemeal. The
Christian Bible was written in Greek. So that's the difference.
That's really where I was going.
Yeah.
Where I'm going is maybe the darkness really was not so much what was happening at the times of Alexandria. It could be that at that moment it was a Yom Simcha. But I think the Chachamim understood the potential danger that can come out of this. Right. And you see it, that it's the case, meaning the entire concept of missionaries. Forget the fact that you built the entire religion on, if you would have kept Torah in Lashon HaKodesh, in Ksav Ashuras, there would be no Christianity. Right. Because who would know about it? Right. Like, they wouldn't have even been able to explain it in a...
Right. They wouldn't have
the claim doesn't make any sense. Right. I'm the guy that God who speaks to me in Hebrew, who I don't understand. The whole thing doesn't make sense. Right. But the moment you translate it,
it could have been a small Jewish sect, but one that never made it to the world.
So to me, when I think about like the hashchasa that came out of really strange. Okay, so Lamaisa. So what's coming out from our Gemara? Well, we'll read a little bit to the Mishnah, and then okay. We'll try to finish the daf because it's a little late. Okay, so what does it say over here? So it said in the Mishnah, Rav Shimon Gamliel's chiluk on the Tanakam, and he says that no, you can't write it in any other language other than Yavanis. Let's leave the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda for a moment.
So the unstated thing was, since only Torah was translated by the Greeks and it was such a good translation, so we can use it, but we can't translate the Bim and Suvim. That was the answer. Meaning the fifth answer.
No, so the fifth.
Why did they bring the mice of the Talmud?
So the Gemara is going to touch on why the language. I mean, we're going to see Yafta looking at Yafes and.
But I'm saying, how did it answer?
Right. So his answer was that Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Rav Shimon Gamliel, since Talmud was only asking for the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, therefore in that time they allowed for the translation because, let's call it Sacharos Tefashos, whatever it is, Lazos, whatever, and therefore we want. And so once that became mutter, and you saw that B'neis, this nace occurred, that was almost like a stempel from Hashem that this is okay, but only that. That's how Rav Shimon Gamliel understands it. Right, and so that will be Rav Shimon Gamliel's opinion, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rav Shimon Gamliel of our Mishnah, who says you can even do it with Tanakh, all of Nach, will say that no, that nace is a giloi, that Greek is good, but not any other language. And the Tanakhama will say that was a giloi that, why Greek? What's so special about Greek? We'll extend it even to all other languages, and that's how you get, which by the way, halacha l'maisa nowadays, it's a big machlokes v'shenim with the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. You can translate Torah into any language. It's not even a shaila. Well, I shouldn't say it's not even a shaila. There are shittas in the Rishonim. I think the Rambam holds that really you're not supposed to do it outside of Lashon HaKodesh, which is ironic considering the fact that the Rambam himself wrote in many other languages, although those were not Sifrei Kodesh, those were his own writings. But the point is that the way we pass in Halach Lamaisa, at least my understanding is, and I'm pretty sure this has to be the case, otherwise our bookshelf has to probably be adjusted a little bit, is that you can write Torah, Tanakh in any language. Rav Moshe does say in a couple of tshuvas, he talks about how one should not translate if they're not someone who knows how to translate. Translation is not something where you just open a dictionary and go boom, 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 as any fourth grader will tell you. When his Mora tells him, please translate the pasuk, and he goes to a dictionary, you can come out with Google Translate. You could play Google Translate games all day.
Both languages extremely well, better than average, in order to be a good translator.
Yeah, translation
not
is,
just one of the languages.
Yeah.
Both.
An anonymous translation is worthless. If you don't know who the translator was, it's a waste of time because you could lose everything. That's where the phrase "lost in translation" comes. Yeah. Okay. So let's just continue the Gemara.
Maybe that's the tragedy. because we don't have such good translators. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we lose the spirit of Torah.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that Art Scroll is not a good thing. It just means that the group that wants to push forward the spirit of Torah and learn new things shouldn't use translations.
Yes, that's actually what Moshe said. Moshe
Mhm.
says that one should try as best as you can if you're going to do a translation to make sure, number one, that you know what you're talking about, and number two, try not to rely on translation when learning something if you can. Meaning, obviously, if it's going to mean you're not learning, learn. But better to learn it in Lashon HaKodesh, first of all, from a Kedusha perspective, but also it's important to not lose what's lost in translation, to have the omek of language that way. No, I want to finish the Gemara.
Okay.
So, Amar Rabbi Avoh, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha Rav Shimon Gamliel, he says the halacha is like Rav Shimon Gamliel, meaning in this that where we only say Yavanis, or that it's mutter be Yavanis, not so clear. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time of the Rav Shimon Gamliel, why is Rav Shimon Gamliel hold that Yavanis is the only language that's mutter? Amar Kra, the pasuk says Yafta lekim leyefes v'yishkan ba'ohalei shem, which we darshan to mean Dvarav shel Yefes, meaning Greek, Yehiyu ba'ohalei shem. For the Gemara, ve'ema goymer u'magoig, which were his sons. Maybe their language is good, meaning it's all part of Yefes. He says no. Amar Bechia bar Abba.
This is 1/3 of the world.
Exactly, it's a tremendous amount of people. Hainu time the chsiv Yafta lekim leyefes Yafyuso shel Yefes Yehei ba'ohalei shem. And what is that? That's the language. It's the Yafyuso of the Yoifi. Beautiful Rashi says over here, what is it? What's the Yoifi of Yefes? Hu lashon Yavan Lishono Yafe Mishal Kol B'nei Yefes. It's the best language. Notice Rashi doesn't say it's the prettiest language. It's the best language of Yefes's languages. And Chanami Lashon HaKodesh is, of course, the most beautiful. Let's cover some ground here. We'll get to the next Mishnah and then get shmuz a little bit. Ein ben kohen meshuach b'shemen hamishcha lemeruba begodim. So just very quickly, what's the difference between a kohen that's meshuach b'shemen hamishcha versus a kohen that is b'meruba begodim? When there's a new kohen gadol, he has to be inaugurated. There's two processes. One is using the shemen hamishcha. If you don't have Shemen HaMishcha, then you just put the 8 big day Kohen Gadol on him, and that's his inauguration. Now, why would we not have Shemen HaMishcha? Yoshua Melech was, he hid it in order to protect it, and therefore we didn't have it anymore. And since we didn't have it, but there were still Kohanim Gedolim after Yoshua Melech, and therefore...
He hid the Shemen or he hid the recipe?
I'm not sure. I think he hid the Shemen, but I'm not sure. That's a good point. So Ein Bain Zelazeh Ella Par Haba Al Kol HaMitzvahs. What's a Par Kol HaMitzvahs? A Par Haba Al Kol HaMitzvahs is talking about really what we normally call the Par Kohen Mashiach. The Par Kohen Mashiach is basically a unique personal carbon that the Kohen Gadol has to bring whenever he's Moira Heter that leads to an Isser Kares. He's matir something that it turns out it was a Chiyav Kares, so he has a special chatas that he needs to bring. Now, he's not the only one who's Chayav Chatas. Even you or I, if we're matir someone to go to do something that turned out to be a Chiyav Kares, we have to bring a carbon chatas. The difference is that our carbon would come from a goat or a sheep, a keves or an ez, whereas the Kohen Gadol, he has to bring a par. It's called the par Kohen Mashiach. So the halacha is that he's not meshuach with the Shemen HaMishcha, then he doesn't have to bring that carbon. Whereas if he is, then he does have to bring that carbon. Meaning it doesn't mean that he doesn't have to bring a carbon. He'll have to bring, like you and I would bring. He'll have to bring a keves or an ez. That's the first, it's the ratio of the Mishnah. And ein bein kohen mishamish lekohen l'sha'avar. What is this talking about? This is talking about, let's say you have a kohen gadol, gets a type of mum, but not a permanent mum, a temporary mum, a mum that is temporarily going to make him pasul aveda. We still need a kohen gadol, so we have someone who jumps in, takes his spot. He's a temporary replacement. The first kohen gets the mum removed. Somehow it goes away. He becomes kosher again for aveda, so he comes back in. So that kohen, while he was working, he's a kohen mishamish, and now he's no longer working, but he was a kohen gadol. Let's call him like I don't know if I'd call him retired. I would call him, for simplicity, we'll call him retired. Emeritus, right? Yeah, right. So what's the difference between after the first kohen comes back? So now there's technically two kohen gadol. One is the one who's working, and one is the one who's not working. So what is the chiluk between the both of them? Meaning they're both kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, Mishnah says, the difference between them is elapar yom kippurim, which is another type of personal carbon that the kohen gadol has to bring, the asiris ha'efa, which is referred to as the minchas chavitin. These are two different dinim that needed to come from mammon that was owned by the kohen gadol. So now it goes like this. In terms of the par yom kippurim, this was effectively a personal chatos that the kohen had to bring. It had to come from a cow, not another animal, and he had to bring it on Yom Kippur. It was besides the normal avodah that the kohen gadol had to do. He had his own personal carbon chatas that he needed to bring. That would only be something that, and it has to come from his money, that is only brought by the Kohen Gadol who's actually serving at that point, not the one who's the emeritus. Whereas the Asiris Ha'efa also, that's called the Minchas Chavitin. It's called Chavitin because it was done by Machfas, which was like a certain type of shovel. They would basically take a tenth of an ephah of grain, and they would use it to make 12 loaves of bread. 6 of the loaves were used for the Talmud Shel Shachar, 6 of the loaves were used for the Talmud Shel Bein Arbayim. But the point is the money that was used to purchase those loaves needed to come from the money owned by the Kohen Gadol. He wasn't the one who necessarily had to do that avodah. Any Kohen could bring up those loaves, but it had to come from his money. So therefore, also you can't come from that. Can't come from the one who's the emeritus. That has to come from the one who's serving. Zok Gemara. If you're telling me that the only distinction between the Kohen Meshuach B'Shem and Mishcha and a Kohen that's a Merubah Begadim is that he's a par haba al kol mitzvahs, meaning the par Kohen Mashiach. Zok Gemara, that's mashma that hal inyan par yom kippurim ve'asiras ha'evas evas ha'shavan, that the din of the second half of Mishnah would apply equally to both of them. And the Gemara is not asking it as kash; it's just making the same pattern of observation as we've been making through all of these ain veins, that those halachas would be the same. Now the Gemara says, one second, let's look at the Mishnah and try to figure out who is the Tana of our Mishnah. Masnisin the like Rav Meir. How do I know it's not Rav Meir? Because the Rav Meir, I have a brayso. Hatanya merubah begadim mevi par haba al kol mitzvahs. Div Rav Meir. He holds that a merubah begadim, a kohen that is inaugurated with begadim, not with the shemen, he brings the par kohen mashiach. Divrei Meir. So that clearly, I mean, as about as emphatic as you can have it, that he's not our Tana of our Mishnah. So clearly the Chachamim is our Mishnah. So now, one second. My time of the Rav Meir. So we know that it can't be Rav Meir. My time of the Rav Meir, however, why is Rav Meir hold what he holds? That you can even have the par Kohen Mashiach brought by a Kohen that is a Merubah Begadim. The Tanya, because the pasuk says Mashiach, Eli Ela Meshuach B'Shem and Amishcha. Merubah Begadim Inai and Talmud Leimer Hamashiach. So since it has a extra A, there's a drasha to tell me that it's going by both. So Lamaisa was saying it can't be Rav Meir, it's got to be the Chacham Sefred the Gemara. But my came not like Rav Meir. But one second, look at the Seifa. Ema Seifa. What does it say in the Seifa? Ein ben Kohen Misham Shel Kohen Shavar Ela Parya B'Kippur V'Asiras Seifa. We saw that there are 2 dinim that don't apply to the Kohen that is no longer working, but rather it only applies to the Kohen that is working. What are those 2 dinim? The Parya B'Kippurim and the Asiras Seifa, the Minchas Chavitin. And the implication, though, is that as far as everything else, they are equal. So us on the Rav Meir, that's going like Rav Meir. How do I know it's going like Rav Meir? The Tanya says in the Brisa, the exact case of the Seifa. Let's say you have a Kohen Gadol that has a psul, umina Kohen acher tachtav, and another Kohen replaces him. Rishon chozel avodaso, the first one after the psul goes away, goes back to his avodah. Sheni kol mitzvahs kahuna gedula olav. He has all of the dinim of a Kohen Gadol, divrei Rav Meir. So you see that he has all of the normal dinim. Rabbi Yossi Omer Rishon Chozel Avodaso Sheni Eino Yiroi Loi L'Koyin Gadol V'Loi L'Koyin Hedget. You see that Rabbi Yossi holds that he can't go back and do any avodah. Right. So what do you see? You see it's not. We said before it can't be Rav Meir. Now it has to be Rav Meir because he's the one who says that he goes back to avodah. And the only distinction is just those two things. But he go back to becoming a Kohen Gadol. He can do the avodah of a Kohen Gadol. From Rabbi Yossi, it's a story to support Rabbi Yossi Shita that he did put him back in as to work as a Kohen Gadol. From Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi ben Ulam Mitzipoiri, who was a Kohen Gadol, Shiur by Psul the Kohen Gadol, Uminu Tachtav, and they put someone else in place of the Kohen Gadol at the time. Uba Ma'aseh Lefnei Chachamim v'Amru Rishon Chozel Avodaso Sheni Eino Yiroi Loi L'Kohen Gadol Loi L'Kohen Hedget, like the din of Rabbi Yossi. Kohen Gadol Mishum Eiva. The reason why the Kohen Gadol can't go back and do the avodah as a Kohen Gadol is because now the other Kohen Gadol is going to be jealous. Kohen Hedit Mishum Malin B'Kodesh L'Ei Meridin, because of a big sugi of Malin B'Kodesh. So what do you see?
Nobody's going to volunteer for this temporary job.
Yeah, exactly, right. So what do you see? You see over here that this second, the Kohen Gadol, the replacement Kohen Gadol, according to Rabbi Yossi, Enochanami doesn't have an avodah, but according to Rav Meir, he does, which means the Mishnah is Rav Meir. So which one is it? Is it not Rav Meir because of the Reisha that a Kohen who's a Merubah Begadim, he has the same din when it comes to Par Kohen Mashiach as the Kohen who is Meshuach B'Shem and Amishcha? Or is it Rav Meir because he holds that the Kohen Gadol who's the replacement goes back to do the avodah? Gemara says, no, it's not fair. What do you mean? Reish Rabbanim v'Sefer Rav Meir. Ask the Gemara. Gemara says, yeah, Rav Chizda in. Reish Rabbanim v'Sefer Rav Meir. That's the exact answer. What do you mean? Why is that a problem? It's the first time you ever saw that one Tana is going to be in the Reish, one Tana is going to be in the Sefer.
We lump together 2 halachos that we paskin like, but they're not both Rav Meir.
Yeah, which is really sort of what Rav Yosef says. So there's a subtle difference. Rav Yosef Amar, no, Rebbe he. It's all Rebbe. Meaning, it's a little bit of a semantical difference, really. Meaning,
Yeah,
either you'll
right.
say the Rabbanon and Rameir, or no, it's all one. If you want to say that B'Shalom, that it's all one person, fine, you'll say it's one person. It's he's saying the Shita of the Rabbanon and the Reisha, and he's saying the Shita of Rameir in this Seifa. Lamais, I'll just tell you the word I heard from Pinchas Gross, and then we'll call it a day. Pinchas Gross. On the All Adaf website, I heard it last night. So nice. So he quotes from, and I'm sure I'll butcher it, but he basically quotes from Rav Hutner. The Rav Hutner was answering a question from one of his Talmidim as to exactly what the pshat is in Ad Loyod, like we saw the other day. How does it make sense that it's Ad Loyod ben Or Haman Lebaruch Mordechai? What do you mean? That's the whole point of the day, is to have the distinction. So he basically, and I'm really simplifying what Rav Hutner said over here, is he said that when I want to point out the difference between two things, if I'm trying to make a meaningful and impactful statement, the way I do it is by saying they're the same in everything other than this. But if I'm saying a superficial difference, like, oh, he's tall and he's short, that doesn't really say much about who the person is. He didn't say this, but I think of it sort of like the way I think of the dress code in yeshiva. The dress code in yeshiva was always, you wear black pants and a black jacket and a white shirt and a hat. Why? Because really, we don't really care too much to make distinctions between how we look, because the token of our character and the learning that we're doing was really where you were able to sort of really spend most of your focus. Let's not spend too much of our focus on those things. But Rav Hutner was trying to point out that maybe the understanding of Ad Loyada means to say it's specifically once a person can get so shikr that he can't tell the superficial difference between Borah Haman Lebaruch Mordechai, that a person can now, that's only step one of the process. Step one of the process is get it to the point where everything's equal. And now let's go find the tochen where the difference is. So that was what Rav Hutner said. But Pinchas Gross just stelled it to what is it doing in our Masech? Rav Tzadok says that you could always find a reason why something's put in Megillah, not in Tainus, not in Yevamis and Nida. Why is it in our Masech the Megillah? Because Megillah is all about Nahapeichu and finding the Adaloyada, finding the Tochen. He says, so that's why all these Ein Bains. Ein Bain Zel is that they're mamish exactly the same. Aleph and Beis, they look exactly the same on the surface, but if you dig deep, you'll find the chiluk. I thought it was just such a beautiful idea. But either way, he said it. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. All right, we'll call it a day. A little bit long today, but Talmud Melech, very interesting story.